Good evening and welcome to the second annual Everett P. Pope Lecture, sponsored by the Bowdoin Marine Corps Society. I am Jack Abbott, class of 1963. The Bowdoin Marine Corps Society was formed in December 2014 by Gil Barndollar, class of 2004, then a Marine Corps captain, Gordon Linke, class of 1950, a Korean War veteran, and me, a pre-Vietnam enlisted Marine. The mission of the Bowdoin Marine Corps Society is threefold. Number one, to connect Bowdoin men and women who have served or are serving in the United States Marine Corps. We now have 73 living members. The establishment of the Bowdoin Marine Corps Society Scholarship Fund, providing financial aid to Marine veterans, children of Marine veterans, veterans of other services, and children of other military services. Today, we are proud to announce our first scholarship recipients, and they are here this evening. Finally, and no less important, we offer to assist the college in the recruitment and support of qualified veterans. I am pleased to report the Bowdoin Marine Corps Society is working with the admissions office to make veterans on campus a reality. I would now like to introduce my co-founder of the Bowdoin Marine Corps Society, Gil Barndollar, who will describe the Everett P. Pope Lecture Series and tonight's event.
Thank you, Jack.
Yep.
Again, welcome to the second annual Everett P. Pope Lecture. The Everett P. Pope Lecture was founded by the Bowdoin Marine Corps Society to enable the Bowdoin community to interact with practitioners and experts in U.S. national security and foreign policy. Major Pope, USMC, was a 1941 graduate of Bowdoin College. While a student here, he was captain of the state champion tennis team and a member of Phi Beta Kappa. Major Pope received the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration, for his conspicuous gallantry on the night of September 20th, 1944. Holding a hill he and his company had seized against repeated assaults by Japanese troops, he and his men had to resort to fighting off the Japanese with rocks in their bare fists before withdrawing with 8 men still standing in the morning. After the war, at 34, Major Pope became the youngest bank president in New England. Throughout his life, he remained a dedicated servant of the college. He served on the board of trustees, established the Pope Scholarship Fund, and helped establish the Haldane Cup at Bowdoin. In 1987, the college granted him an honorary doctorate of law. I'd invite you to learn more about Major Pope and the Bowdoin Marine Corps Society at our website, which is bowdoinmarinecorpssociety.org. It's now my honor to introduce Major Pope's son, Ambassador Lawrence E. Pope, class of 1967.
Well, it's a pleasure and an honor to introduce General Tony Zinni to this Bowdoin audience. I'm very grateful that he was willing to take the time from his busy schedule to give this second annual Everett P. Pope Lecture, and I can't think of anybody better suited to do so. I first met General Zinni in 1997 when he had just taken over the U.S. Central Command, and I was an unemployed ambassador looking for a job as his political advisor. And he hired me immediately, either because of the fine impression that I made or because I was the only applicant for the position. General Zinni was and is a Marine's Marine. Commissioned after graduation from Villanova University, an institution we've heard something about recently. Over a 35-year career, he commanded at every level, from platoon to division, was severely wounded in combat in Vietnam. But to go from the Marine Corps to a joint military command like CENTCOM is to move to that uncomfortable place where military policy meets national politics. It was Napoleon who said that no man is a hero to his valet. And while a political advisor is not quite a valet to a military commander, there are some uncomfortable similarities. But I can tell you now, as I could not in the days when I was working for him, that General Zinni remains a hero for me. It's painful to think that in those days before 9/11, When General Zinni was running the Central Command, we kept the peace in the Persian Gulf with some 15,000 military personnel in the region, most of those at sea. Even then, there were political pressures to provoke a war. I have a vivid memory of General Zinni telling a senior Washington figure that if they wanted him to do that, they would have to get another commander. As the political pressure grew for an invasion of Iraq, General Zinni stood firm against it, not on military grounds principally. The Iraqi army would fold like a cheap suit, he predicted correctly, in private, but because we had no plan to govern the country in the aftermath. 3 years before the invasion of Iraq, he brought together the most senior civilians in our government, from the State Department, CIA, the White House, and the Defense Department, to review the problem of a post-war Iraq. When the invasion came, the results of those deliberations were deliberately ignored, and we live today with the tragic results. Since he left active duty, General Zinni has excelled as a businessman, author, university professor, and especially as a diplomat. He's the recipient of an honorary doctorates from Villanova University, the College of William and Mary, and the Maine Maritime Academy. He's worked on conflict resolution for the White House and the State Department in the Philippines and in Indonesia, and on multiple occasions he's served as an envoy to the Middle East. These days, he's engaged in an effort to resolve the conflict between estranged cousins in Saudi Arabia and Qatar, whose family quarrels complicate American foreign policy. This would be an uphill task in an administration with a functioning State Department. But General Zinni embodies the old adage that optimism is to the diplomat as courage is to the soldier. And he is that old-fashioned thing, a patriot. He will go on serving his country to his last breath with skill and integrity. Semper fidelis is the term, I believe. President, Mrs. Rose, ladies and gentlemen, I give you General Tony Zinni.
Thank you. You know, when Larry reported in, he realized that he was in a very strange environment being a diplomat in a military command. And so after 3 years, when he was getting ready to leave, I asked him about his experience. He said, well, I think I'm going to write a book about my experiences. So I said, Larry, what is the title of the book? He said, Life Among the Klingons. You know, so I think we in some ways created a monster out of Larry. We probably, his father would be proud. We made him a Marine, and he was able to handle the Klingons very well. Now today when I was asked to give this lecture, I asked Larry and I asked several others, what do you think I should talk about? And they thought that I should start with maybe describing, at least from my point of view, what the national security environment is, or more aptly, the global security environment, because it's very complicated and it's very complex and it's very difficult to understand. It's made more complex by those that might argue our government has not done a great job in understanding it or preparing the policies, but in some ways, the complexity and the confusion and the complication adds to that inability. I was asked by General Mattis, now Secretary Mattis, to take on this current mission in the Middle East, and he asked if I would meet with then Secretary Tillerson to take on the mission. I did. I made 2 trips out to the Middle East, and I think after the second one I got back and I felt we had made progress, and I went to brief my boss, and the day I arrived to brief him, he got fired. I thought maybe I could then brief General McMasters, who I know well, and it'd be a good secondary choice, and he got fired. So I have a brief, and if any of you are interested, I'd be glad to give it to you. But one thing that says it all, we recently produced the National Security Strategy, and by law, by the Goldwater-Nichols Act of the mid-'80s, the President's required to deliver to Congress a national security strategy Now, very few presidents do it in time. It's supposed to be within 150 days of the presidency, and it's supposed to each year accompany the budget. And the idea is, I think what Senator Goldwater and Representative Nichols had in mind, that the discussion about what Congress would fund in the way of our national security tools, if you will, diplomacy, the military, our economic power, that it would be based on a strategic discussion. It would be elevated to the level of saying we can argue whether we support it or not on strategic grounds. It has failed miserably to do that. The national security strategy, like I said, rarely gets delivered on time. It's usually so general it isn't very meaningful. It's intended to then generate a cascading form of strategies from the State Department, the Defense Department, and the other agencies of government to work all the way down. There is a current national security strategy out. Unfortunately, when it does go to Congress, we're lucky if you can find a congressman who's read it. Most of the times the discussions about funding basically go around issues like whether it's built in my district, whether I have a particular interest in it. So we have not been able to achieve the level of discussion on policy and strategy based on how we see the world or how we might debate how we should see the world. But of course, some of the agencies of government take this to heart. I will tell you, Secretary Mattis, who's a very close friend of mine, and we've served together for many years, he put a lot of effort into the national defense strategy. Right now, the national military strategy, which flows from that, is being worked on by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dunford, and his staff. And when you read what the Pentagon says, it begins with a description of the environment. And they use 4 terms to describe it. They said the current security, national security environment, global security environment, is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And they make that statement up front because it makes it very difficult to plan and strategize against that. The world is very confused, and I think for those of us who have been around long enough to understand what happened during the Cold War, although you might argue it was a more dangerous time, we could blow ourselves off the planet, it was a time that was ordered. Everybody knew the rules. Soviets knew the rules, Red Chinese knew the rules, we knew the rules. There were some proxy wars, but they were contained. No one got off the reservation. Well, when the wall came down, that kind of went away. I was in Europe when the wall came down. I was in Germany. I was stationed with the European Command as a deputy director of operations. And I watched this process. First of all, it was a shock to us. We've been telling ourselves for 50 years we're going to win, and when we won, we were surprised by it. You know, all of a sudden, the Soviets had thrown in the towel. Gorbachev said, it's over. You don't have an enemy anymore. And we were trying to figure out what to do with it. And there were all sorts of thoughts. My boss at that time was probably one of the most enlightened soldier statesmen I've ever met, General Jack Galvin. He had been the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe for 9 years. And one thing he told us, he called us general officers in. I was a new one-star. And he said, we have got to connect to the Russians and to the former Soviet republics and to the former Warsaw Pact. And we've got to tell them there are no winners or losers. We have to create a relationship that's positive. I want to begin by military-to-military connections. And he contacted the Russians. A number of us generals were sent to Moscow to work with the Russian military. They were very open with us. They were very much willing to share their problems, of which they had many. We spent a lot of time there creating a relationship. I even had a Russian aide. He was a cadet from the propaganda corps named Vlad, who perfected his English by watching Arnold Schwarzenegger movies, which made it interesting when he translated my speeches. I was coming across as the Terminator, I think, in most of my talks. But it was also a time when Secretary James Baker, Secretary of State, had the same feeling as General Galvin about this need to connect. And he assigned Ambassador Rich Armitage to form a group to work with our European allies and others to say, let's embrace the former Soviet Union. Let's do it in a way that's sort of a modified Marshall Plan. Let's show our goodwill. And then let's help them be part of the international community. And Armitage's job was to work the economic and political side while we worked the military side. And I had the good fortune of being assigned to Armitage, too. So I now went from the military coordination to working with him on economic issues and political issues, which was a new experience for someone who had never been in that business. One day, Armitage told me, I want you to speak to the Russians and talk to them about making the ruble a convertible currency. We need a convertible ruble. I thought it was a car initially and found out, no, we're talking about currency, and an infantry officer doesn't get that kind of education and training. But, you know, something happened along the way. Initially, we were seeing what I thought was an initiating of a strategy and a policy and a plan and an approach. For some reason, it all died away. For some reason, we did things that were, I don't think, well thought out. For example, you know, we increased the size of NATO. All of a sudden, it went from 16 countries. Now we're about to bring the 30th country in and reduced its military capability in the process, excluded Russia, brought in Warsaw Pact countries that used to be part of the Russian empire. And so it was kind of an in-your-face. I would argue that Putin is as much a creation that's our responsibility as it is in what happened inside Russia. I mean, we may be made or set the circumstances where a nationalistic Russia embraced someone like Putin and the problems that we see now. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the point I want to make is, for some reason, we shut down our ability to think strategically at that moment. During the Cold War, we had the Kennans, and we began with the Marshalls, and I think the greatest period of strategic thinking in our history as Americans was that period after World War II, from 1944 to 1950. If you look back at the things we accomplished, beginning with the Marshall Plan, for the first time in history, the winners paid reparations to the losers. Marshall could not sell that plan initially, gave 84 speeches, brought the American people from 19% approval to plan to 80-some%. You know, we had the Bretton Woods Conference where we pegged the currencies around the world on a measurable basis, which really helped the economic conditions. Besides rebuilding Germany and Japan, we created the World Banks, the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations, NATO. I'm sure George and Thomas would have been rolling over in their graves that we were involved in entangling arrangements and alliances with the rest of the world. And you know, we were able then to engage the world very differently from a leadership position. And we were thinking out what we needed to do. With the emergence of the Soviet Union, you know, we had a plan of containment and deterrence. The rules were established and got us through some times that were pretty tough, the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Vietnam War and several other experiences that could have blown up. But for some reason, once that wall came down, and I'm going to give you a little personal experience, I arrived just as we stopped manning Checkpoint Charlie. And I arrived in Berlin. I was newly assigned there, and we were supposed to be getting briefings from the Berlin Brigade and our military units there in West Berlin. And they said, we have no briefings to give you. Nobody knows what's going on. Suddenly, the Soviets, the East Germans, had stopped manning Checkpoint Charlie, so we have too. And nobody knows what the rules are. And these briefs we're supposed to give you, they're overcome by events. So we're 5 or 6 of us one-star generals and admirals there, and they said, enjoy Berlin for a couple of days. We have nothing to tell you. And they assigned an Army second lieutenant to sort of mind us and babysit us. And the second lieutenant says, how would you like to go into East Berlin? So we asked him, you know, can we do this? He said, no one knows. And he had this little Volkswagen van. We all crammed in there in our uniforms. We went through Checkpoint Charlie. And, you know, the eeriest feeling in the world, you know, when I was in first grade, we worry about students now and student shooting and the traumatization, which we should all be concerned about. I had to take a pillowcase to school because when the alarm went off, we had to put the pillowcase over us and go under our desks. If there was enough so-called advance warning, we went down into the basement where there was all sorts of civil defense storage areas. And so when you're 6 years old, you know, and you're asking each other, can you hear the bombs yet and the planes? I mean, it was a traumatic experience. And so all my life, I'm listening to stories about Checkpoint Charlie, you know, the Berlin airlift and what it was like to be on the edge of the empire. I'm now crossing the edge of the empire into this place called East Berlin. where there were still bullet holes in the walls from World War II, where these old Eastern German Trabi cars are belching gas. I just came from West Berlin with Audis and Mercedes and BMWs, and I said, well, who were we afraid of here? I mean, this was amazing. We drove around for a while, and the second lieutenant said, let's pull into a Russian caserne, a military garrison. And when I asked him, can we do that? He said, nobody knows. And we drove through, and the sentry there was absolutely befuddled. He didn't know whether to shoot or salute as we came through. And we drove around for a while, and these Russian soldiers all looked like zombies. You know, they didn't, and as I was later to find out, they didn't know what their future held. There was no place for them to go back to in Russia. They were living in boxcars, and their situation was horrific at that time. We made a decision to show good faith in that we actually emptied out all the Cold War stores and supplies we had, a place called Pirmasens in Germany. There were supplies in there like hospital equipment and everything else going back to the 50s. We completely emptied it out and did an airlift to the former republics of the Soviet Union, to Russia, to Eastern Europe, to orphanages, and to places that were in need. And we were able to distribute this to say this is an act of good faith. This is not a winner and loser situation. We had our own president and Gorbachev talking about a peace dividend, talking about a new world order, except there wasn't any. You know, and so the world was allowed to become this volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, situation that we have now. So if I were to give you an assessment now, the kinds of things that are going on that we should concern ourselves about because they can be destabilizing, they need to be understood, or they certainly affect our interests and of course, the interests of the world, which actually in turn will come back to bite us, because this world is, first of all, so intertwined, so globalized, that it's impossible to pull away and isolate. And certainly for us, if we want to continue our way of life, our sense of well-being, our position in the world, we cannot withdraw. Globalization is here to stay. There are good things about globalization and bad things about globalization. Certainly the bad things need to be addressed. Now, we have lately begun to question this. And I think the questioning, when I say we, is not just us, but some of our allies. It began with Brexit, pulling out of the European Union. You're seeing a rise now of maybe more nationalism taking place, more a sense that we've got to reestablish the Westphalian system of the sovereign state because it's in question. Globalization doesn't only deal with economics, it deals with law, it deals with security issues, it deals with social issues, and it's something that we have to address as a globe, internationally, in partnerships. We're finding now that as we're trying to readjust this in many ways, it's being done clumsily. There are issues that should be addressed, but the thought and the idea that we'll go back to unilateral or bilateral approaches and not create coalitions and partnerships and multilateral approaches is dead wrong. And eventually, if we keep trying, we're going to end up paying a price for that in many ways. I think one other realization that we have to come to grips with is the distribution of power. It used to be a bifurcated world. There were those guys on the other side of the Iron Curtain, and there were us, the free world and the communist world. It doesn't work like that anymore. It isn't a we or they. It isn't one side or the other. It isn't you're either with us or against us. The world has become too complicated. We now have a distribution of power, powers rising, powers falling, powers weakening, powers strengthening, and it just goes to prove that you need each other. You need partners, you need coalitions. There is little ability for any one nation or country to do it all on their own, even ours. We may remain the most powerful nation on earth, but that power is not as great as it used to be relative to the other powers on earth. And so beside the Russias and the Chinas and economically the Japans and the South Koreas and the Singapores and the rising countries like Indonesia and others, this power balance and this power distribution is going to continue, which means that you cannot do things alone or bilaterally or unilaterally. It's going to have to be done in creating a number of partnerships. And the partnerships we have are old and worn. The United Nations, NATO, even some of the trade agreements and other things that we have in place need to be looked at. I talked about this to a former national security advisor one time, and I said, every once in a while, it's important to erase the board and start over again. He nearly had a heart attack. Oh, you can't erase the board. We have traditional partnerships, traditional arrangements. Sometimes time changes the factors that let you to create those things. And it's important to relook them. And it's important to, every once in a while, polish them, refurbish them, change them, maybe restructure them in some major way. And in this kind of environment, in the descriptions that I read to you from the Department of Defense, these relationships need to be continuously revitalized in some way and be adaptive to the kind of world we face. We have a number of fragile economies out there in the world. And it used to be, if you said fragile economy, everybody thought third world. Now think developed world. We saw several years ago, we almost saw the Greek economy collapse. The southern tier of Europe have very weak economies. What happens when a major developed country economically fails totally? Can it be bailed out? Can the European Union do it? Can it afford to do it? What's the implication for all of us? Somebody belches in Athens and our stock market takes a dive. So we have this inextricably linked economic system that failed economies almost anywhere, but especially in the developed nations, are things that are going to cause us problems that will have security implications. And we see a number of failed and failing states. And it used to be, who cares? Who cares if Somalia or Yemen become a failed state? Well, the reason you care is, number one, they become sanctuaries for criminal activity, for extremist groups. They create humanitarian problems. There are diasporas and migrations that take place that affect the whole world, whether it's Europe or here or Australia or any place else. And then if they're unable to care for their own people, you generate health issues and tremendous humanitarian issues that will effectively metastasize and spread around the world. And we can see that happening in places where we have these failed states. We are undergoing something that I think is important to understand in depth, which we've not done, will continue for a while, and may mark what historians view and title this part of our history. It's the transformation of the Islamic world. The entire Islamic world, which stretches from North Africa to the Philippines, from the southern provinces of Russia to the center part of Africa, has been undergoing a transformation. The transformation is the adjustment to modernity. And some parts of this society have made tremendous strides and are doing well. Others have not. And maybe it's going to be 50 years, maybe it's 40 years, but it is critically important that this 1.6 billion people society makes it through this. It affects us for obvious reasons. The geography affects us. It's in the center of the earth. It's where our trade routes go through. It is the major source of the highest quality and the greatest amount of energy resources. It can easily export extremism and problems if it's kept unstable. And so all of us have a vested interest in helping them get through this. We overgeneralize, we overstereotype, and we attribute to them things that are not so, to make us feel good in many ways, and try to simplify a very complex set of issues that are going on. I mentioned to a class today, how many of you know how many presidents of the United States have been women? That was the easy question. Then I asked them, how many Muslim women have been head of state? History records 128, and 8 in modern times. Who had the right to vote first, a Muslim woman or an American woman? Muslim women by 2 years in Azerbaijan. So it's not, when we attribute that they can't be democratic because of religious belief, that the role of women can't take its rightful place in their society, we're wrong. The change has to come. I'm encouraged. Larry says I'm an optimist. I'm seeing these changes, some slower than others. They need to move faster, some moving at a rapid rate. Right now, what I'm seeing happening in Saudi Arabia, I would never have believed 3 or 4 years ago would be happening. Whatever the reason, everybody is embracing it, particularly the younger generations, which I think is critically important, that they don't feel as frustrated. They are seeing the changes. And in many ways, for a country like Saudi Arabia, the most conservative religiously of the Islamic states, by them doing it encourages others who have gone out on a limb and begun to do this. But this is going to be continue to be a critical global security issue. One other factor that no one's paying attention to is something that happened 3 to 5 years ago. We as a species, human beings, now occupy or live in cities more than we live outside of cities. We are now an urbanized species. 60% of humans live in cities, and that's growing. What does that mean? Can our cities around the world handle it? Is the infrastructure there? Can we provide for the health care, the water and food resources? And those that are coming into that urban area are coming in because they could not make a living. They've devastated the environment somewhere else to come in. They're overstressing the governance system, the provision of services and resources. And we now have what I think is an urban crisis around the world. We in the United States talk about a need to improve our infrastructure. We're the youngest nation in the world. Our infrastructure may be a century old. What about those cities that are millennia old, that cannot support and sustain the populations coming in? I often tell the military audiences, don't be training in the jungle, don't be training in the desert. That's not where you're going. You better understand how to get into an environment like the city, and better think more in terms of like Belfast and places that you're going to be involved deeply with a functioning or half-functioning population at the same time you're in conflict, and at the same time you're doing everything from fighting to providing humanitarian support and reconstructing an urban area. That's going to be the future. And we're going to see more and more of that as the population within cities increases in many ways. We have a demographic issue in this nation. We are right now at 7 billion people on this planet. We will be at 10 billion by 2050. We'll be at 11 billion by 2100. What is the limit? Where's the tipping point? How many people can this planet sustain? Only 1% of the water on this planet is usable. I didn't even say potable, usable. Food scarcity is becoming a major problem in large portions of this world. How are we going to accommodate this growth? And it's an unbalanced growth. In a developed world, it's actually receding, unless immigration, like in our case, keeps it in balance. But we're seeing aging populations without a younger base to support them. And we're seeing in other places in the third world where it's exploding. So it's an unbalanced increase, and where the needs are greatest is where they can least provide for these needs. We have politicized the environment, which to my mind is shocking and surprising to me. Climate change is real. I'm here to tell you. Why do I know that? I may not be a scientist, but I've been involved in studies on climate change and on environmental degradation. I've seen the data. I've personally gone to where you can see the data. If you don't believe in climate change, tell me why I can take a cruise ship across the Arctic Ocean today. If you don't believe in climate change, tell me why Greenland is suddenly green. If you don't believe in climate change, tell me why those glaciers melted and the people that count on that as a water source don't have it. If you don't believe in it, tell me why there's land loss now and sea rise. Tell me why we're seeing climate zones change, change from temperate to semi-tropical. What does that mean to the agriculture, to the health issues we have, to employment? We put our head in the sand in dealing with this. The commander of the Pacific Command, the last one, on his retirement trip back to Washington in his last testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee, was asked what he saw as the greatest threat in the Pacific. Remember, he has China and North Korea. He said the greatest threat in the Pacific is the intensity of the storms there, the typhoons and the cyclones that we have to deal with. Who saved Puerto Rico? The Northern Command and the Corps of Engineers. Who saved New Orleans? The National Guard and General Honoré and the Coast Guard and Admiral Allen. We're going to continue to see that these crises increase in scope, and the need to deal with them on an emergency basis with probably the only resource we have that can, which is the military. And that's going to be an increasing problem if we won't come to grips with how we are exacerbating the environmental problems by not paying attention to how much we contribute to them. We release greenhouse gases, fluorocarbons. We don't pay attention to issues like water conservation, trying to get more economical ways to desalinate water, to provide the distribution systems. and even for food resources. There are countries in this world that are wealthy enough to buy land in places to grow food so they'll have an emergency stock. We're seeing this in the Middle East with wealthy countries trying to back up the need that they see coming down the road. I think for most of us in this audience, we have come into a new world that is not very familiar to us, and it's the world of social media. It's the world of information and communication technology. I am an immigrant to this world. I freely admit it. I don't understand it. I was saying to a class today, I was with my young granddaughter, and she told me that I was the most intelligent person she ever knew. But she told me that while she was fixing my computer. And I said, you little smart ass, why are you telling me that? And I realized I'll never be able to fix that computer. She'll live with that computer, and she'll make it sing. And the way we communicate today, the reliability of information, all the problems you read about that social media creates, that the ability to communicate now and to communicate misinformation, and it's now become a weapon. We now have weaponized the ability to provide misinformation, and we're going to see it more and more from our potential adversaries. Cyberspace has now become a vulnerability for us, as well as a tool that we can use constructively. Space will be militarized. We've tried to avoid it, but it will happen. Commercially, you can afford what you need in GPS systems and in aerial imagery to target things. You can go in your backyard and build an unmanned aerial vehicle. You can go online and learn how to build explosives to put in the thing. So you can target it from commercial satellites and GPS. You can launch it, and you can put it almost anywhere you want in the world. And some guy in his garage can do this now. And it's been done. It's been done in Syria, and it can be done here. So we face technology issues that are going to be monumental. We face a different world, an information world, where the battleground is not going to be exchanges of kinetic energy. It's going to be these exchanges through cyberspace, through space systems, through information channels. I went out to, after I retired, to Afghanistan and Iraq to do an assessment at the request of the U.S. military. One of the things that shocked me, because I hadn't been retired that long, about 10 years, when I got to Afghanistan, I saw this two-star general that was in charge of messaging. It was a new staff function. He provided the messaging, basically the information to make sure we counter misinformation of what went on. He had a large staff. And now we talk about the battle of the narrative, that the president had better win the battle of the narrative. The president had better understand that his audience is not only the American people, but our enemies and our allies. And if you don't win that battle of the narrative, you can lose support. The enemy can gain strength from it. And so you now are engaged in many ways that we didn't think of before that really could constitute conflict or war. What are the rules? When my systems were hit in CENTCOM as tensions mounted up, and my director of communication came in and said, we had 200 hits on our secure system, 300 hits on our unsecure system. The next day, the numbers went up. I said, we haven't exchanged a shot yet, and I'm already at war. What are the rules? Can I shoot back? We don't have laws that say I can shoot back, even in an attempt to penetrate my systems. I have to demonstrate consequences. That's like saying, if you shoot at me, I can't shoot back unless I can drag a body out of one of my people and show that he'd been hit. I mean, that's basically the way the law translates in this. And what can that do? I mean, the damage that can be done can far exceed, in some cases, what can be done by the kinetic exchange of energy in many ways. I was talking today, or this evening at dinner with the President about education. I think that we don't understand that there are nations in this world that see the competition and the conflict in terms of education. They are investing, and I want to stress that term, investing in education. The Chinese, the Indians, and others, Japanese, see education as an investment in the future. The way to win, the way to become powerful, the way to maintain your way of life, the way to prosper, is to educate the future generations. It's not a duty or an obligation of government to provide it. It's supposed to be seen, or it should be seen, as an investment in your future. You shouldn't have students leaving this institution or any others burdened with debt. You shouldn't have young people who are qualified not able to get an education. You shouldn't have people that cannot go into fields that they want to go into. We should have a connection based on what our economy needs, what our country needs, that encourages people to get that education. We should value the education. It's not just punching a ticket. It's not just getting a piece of paper. It's an attitude toward education. If we create an attitude amongst our young people and our school systems aren't balanced in providing the same level of education everywhere, including our inner cities, and we have the school ain't cool attitude, we are going to fall apart compared with those around the world that would be our competitors that get this and understand this. You know, this world means that we have to look at those that we deal with in a different frame. We used to have simple black and white ways we looked at the rest of the world. You're either our ally or you're our enemy. That no longer applies. I often ask my students, let's take China. Is China a partner? Is it a competitor, or is it an adversary? The answer is all three. How do you manage a relationship like that? I need a partner with China to deal with North Korea. I need a partner with them on economic issues, on environmental issues. They're going to be competitors of ours, economically and otherwise. We're going to have an adversarial relationship when it comes to their projection of power into the Yellow Sea and the South China Sea, and we run freedom of navigation operations. How do you manage complex relationships? You know, I listen to our ambassador to the UN who gets upset when they don't vote with us and won't invite him to lunch. You know, realistically, you're going to have times when, you know, they're going to vote against you. They still love you, but they agree to disagree with you. You have to manage an environment where we don't call every shot, and everything's not going to be perfect. And at the same time, you have to work at this adversarial relationship. You are building a partnership with exactly the same entity you're dealing with. You know, we have some major threats in the world right now that we need to think about. We know the big ones. We know, obviously, China. I don't worry so much about China because I think it's the one nation in the world that actually thinks and acts strategically and is less likely to make a miscalculation. They have a 50, 100-year plan. They know where they are in that spectrum. They aren't going to do anything stupid. They have leadership that's in place. We may not like the form of government, but it's in place. It's accepted. They have the economic power. They are confining their military power and building it up to a level where they're a regional hegemon, but they're not interested in projecting it globally. They'll project their power through economics and political means globally, so it's a marvelous strategy. I would worry about Russia because I think Putin is not a strategist. Putin is an opportunist. He's transactional, and when people are transactional and opportunists, they leap on things without thinking, and they could create a situation where we do miscalculate. North Korea, I would have been more worried about 3 or 4 months ago because I thought he was totally irrational and out of control. I was encouraged by, first of all, the way the South Koreans in a very mature way are dealing with them, invite them to the Olympics, open up a dialogue, calm them down. I was most impressed that he got called to Beijing, which maybe is getting called to his Dutch uncle, telling him time to tone it down. I would approach this not as a mano. This is not a manhood issue. We should not have the president and Kim Jong-un dealing with each other directly. He would love that. You're wrestling with a pig, and he gets dirty, and he loves it, and doesn't do anything for you. We need to deal with this on an international basis. The command in South Korea happens to be a UN command. For those of you that served in Korea, and remember, it is a United Nations command, not a United States command. And it should be the countries in the region. It should be the United Nations that deal with this issue. And we should support it and be behind it, but not get out in front of it, because we play into the hands of exactly what Kim Jong-un wants and what his father and grandfather wanted. You know, we're going to have to deal with things that we don't even think about now from these kinds of threats. Everybody looks at Russia, for example, and looks at the Ukraine, looks at the Baltic. You know, we've seen the leaders of the Baltic countries here in Washington, and you know, that has stirred up NATO to maybe become a bit responsive to the potential threat there. But who's watching Russia in the Arctic? They have built up a tremendous force in the Arctic, modernized their submarine fleet. put their most elite forces up there. They intend to exploit the resources up there and gain control. It's going to be their South China Sea. And we have done nothing about that. There are 5 countries that border the Arctic. This is suddenly going to become a transportable, navigable sea. And there's going to be commerce, there's going to be energy resources and mineral resources up there. It's going to be just like the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Indian Oceans. Are we going to create a 13th fleet to manage it? But these are the things we're not thinking about. And the last thing that I would close with is the issue of nuclear weapons. We have reversed course, unfortunately. There was a time right after the Cold War when we saw the reduction of nuclear weapons, agreements to reduce it. We saw countries like Kazakhstan, Libya, and others who got rid of their nuclear weapons. It was a positive direction. As a matter of fact, I think in many ways we fell asleep at the switch. We weren't taking care of our own nuclear arsenal in the right ways. Much of what the $700 billion budget for the military now has to go in refurbishing our nuclear arsenal that we have. The capabilities have been built up by the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, and others have gained tremendously and closed the gap in many ways. And so now the threat of a nuclear exchange is greater. Since the end of the Cold War, we've seen Pakistan, India become greater nuclear powers. We've seen other countries in the world show interest in gaining a nuclear capability, even allies that worry about us and protecting them under their own nuclear umbrella. So the management of a nuclear threat now comes back on the table, much in the way of the Cold War, but without necessarily the same kinds of rules and controls we had in place. So that's the kind of world I think we have out there, in short. It is very complicated. It is very difficult to understand. It requires the kind of national security policy, thinking, and strategy, more importantly than just force. We are investing heavily in military force, $700 billion budget. We have a military that goes, and the cost of that military goes beyond the next 5 nations put together. It's going to be a tough military to maintain. Of all those people in the United States, those young men and women that would be eligible for military service, 73% do not qualify. So you think about that. We have to recruit from 27% of the eligible population and continue to man it. And that's shrinking. And there's various reasons for them not being qualified. But the answer is not just military power and hard power. We have shrunk our diplomatic corps. We have cut our foreign aid budget. And so the elements of soft power, which have to be blended with hard power, as Joe Nye said, smart power is the right blend of the two. We are walking away from those other elements of power, which are in fact cheaper if you fund them, and actually can gain results which don't require to use military force. I would quote Secretary Mattis that said, if you don't support our State Department, if you don't support our aid budget, you better buy me more ammunition, because you've thrown me in the breach with no other recourse or alternative. So this is the world we live in. And I think that the greatest maybe fault we have is we stop thinking strategically. And we have not been thinking about the kind of world we face, the kinds of objectives and the way we think about what we need to achieve in this world, and the best ways to get it done. And if we don't do it pretty soon, I think we're going to see these kinds of things overwhelm us. I want to thank you again for inviting me. It's been great. And my hosts here, including Larry and the president of Bowdoin and the society, have just been wonderful for the last 2 days. Thanks again, and I'll be glad to take any questions or comments that you have. Hey.
I salute your comments about climate change, and I recall a conference 20 years ago in the State Department where you spoke eloquently about the importance of that at a time when you were managing a series of conflicts across the CENTCOM scale of 22 countries. Do you think the United States, given all the activity it's always called upon to get involved in, and you were involved in the efforts in Indonesia in, 2003? Should have its own command for humanitarian relief?
Well, first of all,
We always end up doing the work.
Yeah.
And should there be a separate command and perhaps related to that, a way to involve people in public service as not a full draft, but something more attractive where people would know they're not necessarily going to be involved in a shooting war?
I think that for the most part, the ingredients to help in humanitarian relief are out there. The military has a role. The military has tremendous capacity to meet the emergency need. I've been on a lot of humanitarian missions in peacekeeping, humanitarian disaster relief, humanitarian assistance, and the military can get to the scene of the crime very quickly. We can provide all the kinds of basic resources for survival. I mean, everything from mortuary services to engineering to rations and food and water, security, you name it. I can give you a list of 40 things we can do. The military is not the ultimate solution. When it moves from the emergency phase to the recovery phase, that's when you want to get the military out of the business. And I'll tell you why, because first of all, the military has other missions, and you're draining away from those missions. But secondly, the military is a very expensive way to approach these things. I was in northern Iraq with the Kurds during the emergency and provide comfort. And when we first went in with the military to save them, they were in the hills and they were freezing to death and starving, and we went in with 500,000 of them we had to save. We lost 10,000 in the hills. And we were feeding, just an example, we were feeding the Kurds with military resources. It was costing us $5 a day per person. Once we went to the recovery phase and we contracted the transportation and the food resources from the local Turkish community, it went down to $1 a day. So through contracting and through civilian efforts, we actually reduced the cost. We have NGOs that can work in that area. We have our own USAID. We have the United Nations and other organizations that are quite capable of dealing with the recovery phase. We need to work better on coordinating all this and doing the handoff in the right way and the smart way. There is a third phase, though. The third phase is the sustainment phase. So when they come out of the emergency phase and the recovery phase, who's going to help them put together a government, an economic system if it's been crushed and it's not restorable? Who's going to help them put the social programs together, put the security forces together? That's the one we never get right. We don't do nation building right. Unfortunately, now what we do, we dump it on the military for the emergency piece, and we leave it there. Some NGOs will come in on the periphery, but we end up with the U.S. military trying to develop a country and run it, which we don't have the expertise. It's not the right mission for us, and sometimes it's the least acceptable to do that. I think everybody appreciates the emergency effort. So I would answer your question to say the work needs to be done on what we do on those second two phases, the recovery and sustainment phase. We need to build better capabilities internationally. It's not just a U.S. effort. I think we can do a better job on our aid agencies and the kinds of, we have NGOs that are American NGOs and others. We need to do a better job of coordination, certainly. But then we need to develop the capability to go in with others, preferably the United Nations or regional organizations like the African Union and others, to rebuild a country. Better to use regional organizations, invest in them ahead of time, train their forces, peacekeeping forces, humanitarian forces, local NGOs. They will need support, but better them on the ground with boots on the ground than us. They understand the culture. They understand what the requirements are. They should be supported by us. We may have to provide more command and control, more sustainment, especially in the early phases. But we need to answer your question, we need to create the capabilities locally and internationally and support them.
General, thank you for a very, very stimulating talk. Can we reset our relationship with Turkey? And if so, how would we do it?
I think the way to reset the relationship with Turkey is to come at it through the NATO alliance. Turkey got discouraged. Turkey has tried for a long time to become a European country, and they were rejected from membership in the EU, and we're very bitter about that. So they turned south. So we'll exert our influence in the Middle East and elsewhere. That's become very dangerous. I mean, some of the countries out there I just came from see this as the resurrection of the Ottoman Empire in some ways. We obviously are in conflict with them in Syria because the Kurds we support the Kurds, and they were the ones that fought the hardest against ISIS. They go in and attack the Kurds because the Kurds in Syria support the PKK, their own internal Kurds that are in revolt. But Turkey is going in a bad direction. It's getting more religiously conservative. It's beginning to sidle up with Russia and find partnership with Iran. We need to stop that in the tracks. We need to rebuild the relationships in many ways. It's not going to be easy. Part of the solution is to work military to military through. That's always been a strong relationship. Diplomatically, we've got a long way to go. Erdogan's not the easiest guy to deal with, and I think maybe has given up on this relationship to a certain extent. But if we lose that relationship, what we have now developing in the Middle East, this is the reason why my mission out there to fix this rift between Qatar and the other Arab nations is our coalition, the Gulf Cooperation Council plus Jordan and Egypt, is beginning to come apart. And we're seeing an adversary coalition build up with Turkey, Iran, Russia, Syria, and Hezbollah. And that is a dangerous mix. I think what we have to be really careful is watching what Iran does next. We have lost Syria. I mean, we are done in Syria. And Assad is going to reassert his power with Russian backing, Turkish backing to an extent, and certainly Iranian backing, and Hezbollah. And if Iran decides to up-arm Hezbollah with more missiles and more sophisticated military equipment, you will see Israel strike them. And we will be in another Middle East war. This one is going to be much more complex with the parties involved. So Turkey's role in this is critical. We got to peel them out and get them back into the relationship with us, which is not going to be easy. I know it is a priority for the administration and priority for State Department and the White House right now. Yes, I think they want you to go to Mike, or else they can't hear you.
Thank you very much for your talk. You gave us so much to think about, but one thing that stuck with me is that you said that many of our international organizations are really the product of the post-World War II era, and that they need to be rethought. And I wonder if I could get you to talk a little bit more specifically about those. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, good question. Well, you know, we built a very strong military alliance in NATO. It's been allowed to atrophy to a great deal. We need to rethink NATO, its membership, its mission. It doesn't really have a mission as such. I mean, right now, with a resurgent Russia, you could sort of say that that's a reborn mission. But we have operated, you know, when Larry and I were at CENTCOM, our government used to talk about the Gulf Coalition this, the Gulf Coalition that. And when we would go out there, the leaders out there would say, what is this coalition? I didn't sign an agreement. You know, we made it up, basically. There was no NATO-like agreement. If you hear our talk with regard to North Korea, we talk about our allies and our coalition in the Pacific, which basically Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and others, and we're trying to develop more, Australia. But there's no formal alliance. And I think without some sort of formality to the organization and structure to it, where you demonstrate your will, your resolve, your commitment to each other, and you develop the capability to operate together, certainly in a military sense, it's not a real coalition. And so when we talk about partnerships, and we should take this beyond just military partnerships, going back to the question of humanitarian relief, you could create these relationships in that area too. And I think places like Africa, that makes a lot of sense where we build those capabilities. But the key is you've got to formalize them in some way, because no one understands what their role is or what their commitment should be or what your commitment is to them. So in each of these, there needs to be the thinking of a more formal arrangement, much like we've done with NATO. Or else, you know, people are going to begin to wonder, what am I supposed to do? In NATO, you're supposed to provide forces that are funded to a certain percentage of your GNP. Now, that's fallen off, and the current president has called them on it, and now they're beginning to pick back up. So we had a commitment. Without that commitment, you're not going to get the same levels, and you can count on each other that you can't get the same degree of cooperation, interoperability, making sure you have the systems, command and control, and other things that can operate together, not just on a military sense, but make sure your policy is aligned and that sort of thing. So my short answer to you is we need more alliances. As I mentioned, this world is not a unipower world or a bipolar world. It's going to be a multi-power world. And we need these alliances to be made more formally so we understand the commitments. Sure. No, I think I could. I'll repeat it.
I thought I understood you to say, however, that it was really problematic that we extended NATO right up to the border of the Soviet Union by including the Baltic countries and the East former European, the part of the Soviet satellite countries.
Yeah.
And so I'm not clear
Yeah.
exactly what you mean with respect to NATO.
Yeah. Well, with respect to NATO, if you're going to change NATO, first of all, what happened to NATO in 1989, 1990, its purpose for existing went away, which was a Soviet enemy that, that could be threatening. So when the enemy went away, if you were going to continue the existence of NATO, you needed a new purpose and mission. We never did that. We increased the size of NATO without a purpose or mission. We debated out of area. We went to war in Afghanistan under the NATO, but, General Shinseki used to say there are swimmers and non-swimmers. So if you send a truck company and that's your commitment, nice, but, not really what we expected. So what I'm saying is the organizations have to have a purpose. If you change the organization, it has to be reflected in what your purpose is or your new purpose is. And you have to have, like I said, a commitment from everybody in there as to what they're going to do regarding what the mission is toward, the purpose of your existence. NATO became a self-licking ice cream cone. It had no purpose, and it just kept growing. And they grew with people that joined that didn't really have a military commitment. It was part of the club, and it was nice to be under the NATO umbrella. But that just leads you down the road to more problems in the long run. So an organization like NATO, like any organization that we put together, better have a reason for its existence. And every once in a while, as I said before, you need to go back and review that purpose. You have to erase the board and think about, is it really relevant today? Does it fit? Does it need to change in some ways or redefine the purpose? Yes.
Thank you. I apologize. This question is a little bit grim. I just wanted to mention I agree with your assessment about Kim Jong-un meeting with President Xi Jinping was very encouraging. I've been working with China since 1982, and it was very exciting. Then the next day, thinking about the worst case scenario, which I don't think will happen, but I want to ask you what your thoughts are. Do you think President Xi is truly looking at, helping out in the region, being the mentoring uncle, helping with peace, or, the other part of China that we all know is looking at the economic gain and other sorts of gains? Worst case scenario could be you help us, or we have your nuclear weapons, and we will then do all this economically and help you with the rest of the world. Do you have any thoughts on that kind of pessimistic scenario?
No, I think the Chinese leadership, their purposes deal with their strategic objectives in the end state. If Kim Jong-un can serve their strategic purposes, fine. If he begins to do things that could upset their purposes, that could create a confrontation, create a war on a peninsula, cause us, for example, to arm South Korea with nukes, or think about things that could happen the Chinese don't like, that upsets their strategic design. And so I don't know this for sure. I would like to think that he was called there to make sure he wasn't doing anything that interfered with their strategic objectives, that he wasn't getting off the reservation in a way that could cause us to strike or to act in a way that creates a situation that upsets their plans in the region. I think they like the idea that North Korea is in their sphere of influence. They like the idea that it annoys us at times, but I don't think they want to see this go to a point where there's a red line and we take military action, or the South does, or we put nukes on the peninsula, or we upgrade the exercises in some way, because that disturbs their goals. their expansion into the seas around there, they call the 100th anniversary of the Great Humiliation, where they're going to return to the full sphere of influence of the dynasty before the colonial powers came in. That's the theme, and it's like a 100-year goal, and they intend to build the military capability, the economic influence, the hegemonic influence in the region to get there. If North Korea fits the plan and is doing things that help in any way, fine. If it is beginning to do things that might upset that, cause a miscalculation, I think they will sit on Kim Jong-un's head, which I think part of this discussion had to do with that too. You know, and what should not be lost on us is to understand some of the cultural things. Kim Jong-un was called to Beijing. That is a signal. You know, you can misread that in some ways, and they would like it maybe to be publicly perceived as that they're cooperating, coordinating, but there's symbolism in that, cultural symbolism, that you need to understand too.
If you look at the clinking of the glasses, President Xi's wine glasses here.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
Sir, thank you for being with us tonight. My name is Sam Long. I'm a former infantry officer and current business school student down in Boston. And thanks to Jack and Gil for putting this event on. It's been great. It was interesting to me that Professor Yarbrough asked you about NATO and marching NATO up to the borders of the former Soviet Union. You know, I met Gil Barndall in the Republic of Georgia, where we served as combat advisors to the Georgian army. And the Georgians were promised consideration for membership in the NATO if only they would send some infantry battalions to Helmand. And 5 years later, they're 15 battalions deep into Helmand and no closer to NATO membership. And so I think, woe be unto the ally that takes some of our promises sometimes. But my question is not about Georgia. It's about the national security strategy that you outlined. And you gave us a litany of problems to think about. And I think you're someone who spent most of their career, especially since the late 90s in the Middle East. And I've only got, the one deployment and the one ribbon. But I look at Syria and I ask myself the same question that you asked when you drove through Checkpoint Charlie, which is, what do I have to be afraid of here? I look at Saudi Arabia in an era when we're pumping 12 million barrels of oil out of West Texas a day, and I ask myself, what do we have to be afraid of here? Mm-hmm. And I look at the Middle East in general, and I acknowledge and I'm conscious of some of the societal and civilizational adjustments that are going on in the pan-Islamic world, and I acknowledge the concern there, but I have begun to question, as someone who's now 30 and has completed his Marine Corps service, what is the return on investment for American involvement in the Middle East when Appalachia is crumbling, when our young men are shooting each other on the streets of Baltimore and Los Angeles and Chicago and Houston, when our infrastructure is a global embarrassment. Yeah. And I wonder if the national security establishment, which you're a part of, has begun to fall in love with its own mission. And where do you draw the line, and what is truly strategic for Americans to think about in the world, and when do we need to look inwards?
Yeah,
Thank you.
Great questions. First of all, to kind of support the theme of your question, is we shouldn't knee-jerk into every commitment. We shouldn't look at ourselves as the world's policeman, as the phrase goes, because we can't do it all. We have to selectively do it. But you need to understand, when we talk about our dependence on Middle East oil, and so if we can pump it, if we can get it from Canada, we can get it through shale sources and through West Texas pumping and all that. So why do we need Middle East oil? It's not the way the energy economy works. Oil is fungible, like natural gas. It goes into one pot. If Western Europe, who depends heavily on Middle Eastern oil, or Japan, or South Korea or others, if they lose access to it and their economies tank, ours will too. So we have an economic system that you can't break away and isolate it. This is like trying to extract that pound of flesh and not cause any other damage. It's not going to work. We are inextricably engaged in a globalized economic system that we will suffer if that source of oil is cut off, or that source of natural gas. First of all, it's the largest reserves in the world, and it's the highest quality, both in gas and oil. Secondly, if you look at that area of the world, it's where the major trade routes of the world to go through, east-west and west-east. So when you look at the Straits of Malacca, you look at the Strait of Hormuz, you look at the Bab el-Mandeb, the Suez Canal, those choke points, which are right around the area that we might question, why should we be there? When you look at the shipping channels and the level of trade that goes back and forth there and that is critically important to us, should we lose control of that, it would be devastating economically again. If you lose control of the region and you don't manage it, you could create situations where bad things get exported from there. It could be migrations, it could be diasporas, it could be extremists or whatever. I mean, the world isn't as, you can look at the world by saying, let me look at every drop of oil and see where it came from. That really doesn't tell you anything about the economic system that it supports and its interdependency and what could happen to it. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't think through how we make those commitments. There are ways we can do this by, I'm going to go back to my point about more demands on our allies who may be more directly dependent on that. This shouldn't just be a U.S.-only mission. Why do we let it devolve into that? Where are other allies that are more dependent? I think you're hearing that come out of the White House now, maybe not in the most artful way, but that you need the greater participation, especially where the dependencies may be greater than ours. But the fact of life is we are the big guys. We are the only guys that can pull it together. We do have vested interests in there. If you were to pull out and say, I don't care about Middle East oil, I don't care about Middle East security, I don't care about the trade routes, I don't care about access and free flow of energy, let somebody else do it, check your 401k, because it's not going to look good.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. You've painted a very complex picture and somewhat depressing picture. I was wondering if you were a retired general in the Chinese army and you were at that platform and had 1,300,000,000 people and the complexities that the Chinese society have, what are they thinking right now?
Well,
about climate change,
yeah,
about all this sort of stuff, about the complexities of the world?
I think that the Chinese have, the Chinese are spurred by a couple of things. I think for one, they're realizing the sources of their power, potentially. One is economically. I mentioned, education. I think they see that they are in a position now to reestablish what they feel is their birthright dominance in the region. Their sort of the regional being the regional hegemon, and they're about that. That's their strategic design. What they feel is their, if you will, God-given right to be the dominant power and to return to that, and to do it in a way that doesn't get them, because they learn. If I were that general, I'd say, what do I learn from what the U.S. is doing? Go back to the last question about is the U.S. get itself overcommitted? Is the U.S. When they conduct military operations, do they do it in the most intelligent way? What has gone wrong? So that Chinese general is writing a lot and thinking a lot and learning a lot from what they observe. They want to emerge as a global power in a very different way. As I said, they see their military not as their global stretch, but as their regional security and their regional God-given dynastic ambitions being fulfilled, but they see their stretch into the world through other means, economically and politically. That's how their influence is going to be. When I was out in the Middle East in my time at CENTCOM, one of the leaders out there said, the image of an American in this part of the world is a soldier in full combat gear. The image of a Chinese leader here is a politician or a businessman. And, you've got to balance your influence here in different ways. The way Chinese business is promoted, the way they stretch out and do their assistance and aid, the way they stretch their political influence is much different than the way we do and gets well received. They're much more involved in third world areas, especially places like Africa than we are. So, if I'm the retired Chinese general, I'm thinking more strategically and long term. The one quality they have that we don't, and most nations in the world don't, is strategic patience. They'll get there. They understand how to get there, and they'll learn. And if they make a mistake, they'll recover, think about it, and move on. Remember, they don't have an election every 2 years for their congressman and every 4 years for their president. They don't have cabinets that come and go. So there's consistency in governance. And like I said before, it's not the form of government we like and want, but it is consistent, it's established, and it's accepted. And it allows for strategic planning and strategic follow-through and strategic modification, into the future. And so it's my view, if I'm that retired general, is how do we continue this? And what do we leverage? All those people that I've had that used to be a burden, do I turn them into a positive? Is that a future market? Is that a manpower force that I educate? Do I outproduce my competitors? Do I outproduce them in a way where I could provide cheaper labor? How do I leverage technology? How do I copy it? How do I steal it? And those are all strategic questions.
All right.
You got a second question, or are you giving me the hook?
Why doesn't our country think more strategically?
Because we turn over the leadership.
We did after World War II, but is it a function of our broken political system? If you think about it, 6 of the last 7 presidents were either governors, a relatively inexperienced senator, and the current occupant who has no experience whatsoever. And the one president who did have some significant experience, George H.W. Bush, exercised restraint during the collapse of the Soviet Union. He dealt with Iraq's invasion of Kuwait sensibly. He didn't pound his breast after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Is it a function of our political system where you have the head of a major political party, won't go into which one, a few years ago saying our chief objective is to defeat the President of the United States? Nothing about the national interests of the United States. Why don't we think more strategically?
Well, let me challenge you a little bit on your history. George H.W. Bush, who I personally, because he's come out on a few battlefields I've been on, and I think he's an American hero, and I think his handling of the first Iraq War was genius, and I attribute a lot to Brent Scowcroft and to James Baker. Colin Powell was the chairman, Cheney, and he was sane at the time, and the Secretary of Defense. So, so I think he made a great decision. But I would tell you one thing he didn't do. When that Cold War ended and collapsed, he was asked by a number of people, all right, it's a new world order. You said it. It's going to be different. What's the strategy? His answer was, oh, you mean the vision thing. We don't need that. Barack Obama said, I don't need George Kennan's. I don't need strategy. Then you become a tactician. You're transactional. I would argue, and this is a great argument, it's a true debate, and we could argue it from a historical perspective, that the last strategic president we had was Dwight Eisenhower. And we haven't had a strategic president since then. Not that we haven't had presidents that I admire. I worked for John Kennedy's election when I was a Democrat. I worked for somebody else when I was a Republican. Now the pox on both their houses. I won't have anything to do with them at all. And so in a way, even if they are good men and want to think strategically, I would ask these questions. What prepares them, to think and act strategically? I mean, I go to the National War College, the Command and Staff College, career level school. I have this unbelievable planning process in the military. I believe I'm supposed to plug into somebody who has an equally demanding and structured process of thinking and acting strategically and preparing strategic objectives, political objectives, ends, ways, and means. Well, if somebody comes blasting into office and maybe doesn't have that, there's no system, there's no school they go to. Every 4 years we turn over. Even 8-year presidencies turn over their cabinet, at least, even an 8-year president, at least 3 times. At the rate we're going now, we'll break that record. And so the system is bad. I would offer to you a presidential term of, let's say, 6 years. One term. The president no longer is a member of a political party. He cannot campaign. He is an elder statesman. He is our elder statesman. He's totally focused on the job. We have senators that can do 2 6-year terms. We changed the House of Representatives from 2-year terms to 3-year terms, and they can do 4. And we go back to what Goldwater Nichols tried to do, that every debate and discussion in terms of funding and in terms of what we do in the world has to be based on a strategic dialogue. Not to personal interest, not to self-serving interest in a given district, but has to be moved to that level. But what we're talking about and trying to fix is never going to be fixed. You know, we're in a system now that the people that are in it are either trapped in it or succeeded in it. So they have no motivation to change it in any way.
So I'll follow up with a question. Is it a game, set, and match?
No.
The Chinese do have a strategic
No, because you got
advantage.
young guys like the one there that threw the question out, question what the hell we're doing and why. I mean, that's our future. And so, you know, as we pass this off to the next generation, let's hope that they challenge all this and they think differently. Look what's happened to these high school kids that are on the streets now. They have whether you agree with it or not, I'm not making a political statement here, but I like the idea they're active and they're thinking about their future and what affects them. So I'm hoping they stay motivated to, you know, to engage and, you know, not fall asleep at the switch. Part of our problem is I think we got lulled into a process based on the Cold War and what we went through, and we never come to grips with the post-Cold War era. So the next generation is going to have to pick it up. It may be that, you know, we've lost a period here of about 3 decades that we need to rethink about how we look at the future. I had dinner with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff the other night, and I got a kick out of, he was talking to the people around the table, and he looked over at me, and he said, that's the last generation, you know, they had a different time. And I said, it wasn't so different. You know, we were confused too. I mean, you know, you're just as confused. So, you know, the hope is always in the future, and and I want to go back to what I said about education and understanding. What I told the class today I talked to, don't think yourself just as citizens of the United States, you're citizens of the world. And we can't be isolated. We have to think globally. We better think globally about things like the economy and things like the environment and other issues because it knows no borders. You know, Bismarck said it was all about geography and history. Forget geography. We've penetrated borders long ago. Geography, mountains and oceans don't mean anything anymore. So we got to rethink what sovereignty means and how it's defined and how it's measured. Yes, ma'am.
You've brought up so many different interesting things. I just have one quick question, because you mentioned nuclear bombs earlier, and then you mentioned them bringing nukes to maybe South Korea. My question is, what is the story about nuclear bombs and our saying, oh, well, this country should have it, that country shouldn't have it, or this country? How do we deal with that? I mean, they could destroy all of us.
Well, there's an international agreement that basically should, if it were enforced or was adhered to, that freezes in place what we have. Like the Iranians have violated, I don't think they signed up to it, the nuclear agreement, you know. And so we tried to get some sort of international cooperation on sort of freezing in place. What we've done is the superpowers at the same time we did this is we actually bought nuclear weapons away from places like Kazakhstan and Libya, paid them to get rid of it. We got a new agreement with Russia and others with our allies to reduce our nuclear arsenal. So right at the end of the Cold War, there were measures taken to change this equation. But now that's, you know, unfortunately, there are 2 reasons why proliferation is a danger right now. One is someone like Kim Jong-un that thinks possessing nuclear weapons is your card to being considered, you know, somebody important in the world and a superpower, and he does it at the expense of his people and his economy. The other is security. If the guy across the pond has a weapon and it could reach me now, I better have one. You know, this is the mutually assured destruction argument that we went through in the Cold War. So those are the 2 reasons. And the way you stop the second reason is you got to put allies under a single nuclear umbrella to say, don't get nuclear weapons, we'll cover you by ours, one measure. We have not found a successful way, except through maybe sanctions and embargoes, to try to affect the others. We can make an argument that Iran finally came to the table, and you could argue whether it was a good agreement or not, because of the sanctions, and that Kim Jong-un is backed down from testing and all because the sanctions are beginning to hurt. So that's the other alternative, is punishment in a way. If they come back to the table and there's going to be nuclear reductions, we have to find a way now for incentives to keep it in place in some way. So it's a tricky business because of all these parts to it.
So you're positive in your answer?
I would say I'm positive as long as, this is when I went back to Kim Jong-un going to Beijing. The rational thinkers are in Beijing. If he's irrational, I want to be assured there's somebody rational that could have control over him, not left to his own devices. So where there is rational control of these things, you know, we worry often about Pakistan, and we have assurances from their military and their control. So I'm more assured if I understand there's rational control of these weapons, not so much that that country's going to use it, but somebody in that program, like A.Q. Khan in Pakistan, might try to sell it or provide it to somebody else. And you know, North Korea was providing knowledge and assistance, technical assistance to Iran in the past. So that's where the worry comes in, the rationality or the ability to transfer it in some way.
So we cross fingers and thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
everything you have said.
And thank you very much for coming out tonight.